there is actually one bug that currently exists in our application, and we're going to try to fix it in this lesson. And the bug is related to timeline stopwatch component. So for example, if we try to select the time for a particular activity, and then go ahead and start tracking time for this activity. And let's say we have tracked 5 seconds for this activity, and for example, we'd like to go ahead and remove this activity after. Then we will see that timeline stopwatch component still shows 5 seconds, but the removed activity was reset. And if after this we're gonna select different activity in here, then the already tracked time should be subtracted from the initial time that we have previously selected for this activity. But as we can see, this time remains unchanged. But we should actually subtract those 5 seconds from this time. So currently our time is out of sync between timeline stopwatch component and between the time stored inside timeline item object. As we can see in here, local time of timeline stopwatch component shows 5 seconds, and the time stored inside activity seconds property of timeline item object shows 0 seconds. So in order to fix this issue, we have to know when we're removing activity, and after activity removal, we should always keep this time in sync. So let's try to fix it right now. Let's go ahead and do this. Firstly, let's recall what happens when we are removing activity. Inside activity item component, there is local function delete and reset activity, which gets called whenever we remove activity. And besides removing activity, we're also calling function reset timeline item activities. Let's see what this function is doing. So it's actually clearing an ID of activity we're about to remove from all timeline item objects. And besides resetting activity ID, we're also resetting the time. But in fact, if after activity removal, our timeline stopwatch component would have some tracked time, we should not actually reset this time and assign 0 to activity seconds property. So first of all, let's find a way how we can detect if we are removing some activity inside timeline stopwatch component, and to do that, we can leverage function watch. So in here we're gonna call this function, which accepts 2 parameters. Both of these parameters will be closures. In our case, the first closure is going to return that property we're about to watch. And since we need to know where certain activity will be removed, we're gonna be tracking property activity ID on timeline item object. And when this property gets reset, in other words, when this property gets assigned value null, we will know that this activity was removed. And when the activity is removed, we're gonna execute the code we're going to specify in the second closure. And in order to keep time in sync, we're gonna call update timeline item activity seconds function, which is basically going to keep the time in sync by adding existing time of the timeline stopwatch component to activity seconds property of the timeline item object. So we need to provide this function with 2 arguments. The first argument will be timeline item object that we'd like to keep time in sync for. And the other argument will be current time of this stopwatch that is, by the way, stored inside seconds reactive variable. So let's reference this variable in here, specifically value stored in this reactive variable. And by the way, let's only call this function when current stopwatch is running. So we can additionally check when the stopwatch is running by checking the following variable is running. If it's not false, that means our current stopwatch is running, and then we're gonna sync the time by calling update timeline item activity seconds function. And actually we're going to change implementation of update timeline item activity seconds function a little bit to make it easier to understand. So as you can see, currently this function is gonna add the time passed as a second parameter to the time stored inside activity seconds property of timeline item object. But what we're gonna do instead is actually accept the time that we will assign directly to activity seconds property as a second argument, without having to add this time. So what I mean by that is, instead of using compound assignment operator in here, we could just use normal assignment like this. And to make it possible, we have to change the way we're calling this function in a couple of places inside timeline stopwatch component. So as a second parameter in here, we're going to pass the following expression. We're basically going to add 1 to existing time stored inside this timeline item object. So we are referencing activity seconds property and adding 1. And then the resulting time will be just assigned to activity seconds property. And finally, let's do the same thing with the third function call. So here as well, besides actually passing negative value stored inside seconds variable, we're going to subtract this time from activity seconds property of timeline item object, and then the resulting time will be assigned back to activity seconds property of timeline item object. So now let's check it out how it looks in the browser. We're going to set the goal for the coding activity and then start tracking time on timeline page for this activity. And once 5 seconds will be tracked, we're gonna stop this stopwatch and take a look at Vue developer tools. So as we can see right now, local state of our stopwatch component, which is 5 seconds, is equal to the value stored inside activity seconds property of timeline item object. So as we can see so far, our time is in sync. But what if we try and remove coding activity? Let's check those two values again. And this time we can see that the time is out of sync again. Activity seconds property was reset, but local time of timeline stopwatch component still shows 5 seconds. And this 5 seconds was not subtracted from remaining time of reading activity. And the reason this is not working as intended yet is because we are trying to keep time in sync only when our stopwatch is in the running state. But we actually have to keep time in sync all the time, no matter whether our stopwatch is currently running or not. So let's remove this condition and check again in the browser. So let's repeat all those steps again by assigning time for this coding activity and then start tracking time for this activity on timeline page. Once stopwatch shows 5 seconds, we'll stop it and then check what time is displayed on activities page. As we can see, the tracked time was subtracted from the remaining time of the coding activity. So far so good. So let's try to go ahead and remove this coding activity and then on timeline page. Let's check if the time of stopwatch component is still in sync with the time stored inside activity seconds property of timeline item object. And now everything is good. Time is the same. So we were able to keep the time in sync. By detecting when we are removing activity, we're gonna call out the timeline item activity seconds function to assign already tracked time of the stopwatch component to activity seconds property of timeline item object. And this way we're keeping this time in sync. And let's see now what happens if we're gonna choose different activity. We're actually supposed to see that this tracked time, which is 5 seconds, should be subtracted from the remaining time for the reading activity. And this is exactly what we're seeing. Instead of seeing 10 minutes, we're now seeing 9 minutes, 55 seconds. Same thing goes with another activity training. If we select this activity in here, then on the activities page, remaining time will be affected. 5 seconds will be subtracted from the remaining time of the training activity. And if we're gonna keep tracking this time, we will see that activity seconds time will be always in sync with seconds reactive variable in timeline stopwatch component. So as we can see, that bug was pretty tricky to discover and to fix. But now that it's fixed, we can continue development in the next lesson.